He always had this need to confirm, to measure, to calculate how much you're still attached to him. It's not innocent curiosity. It's a silent experiment, carried out in the shadows, where every conversation with one of your friends becomes a piece of information gathered as if it were gold. You might not even notice at first. The questions come disguised, as if he just wants to know how you're doing. But there's a weight in the tone, a precision in the type of question. It's not, "How is he doing?" It's, "Does he still talk about me?" Or, "Did he mention anything about dating someone?" He knows he couldn't ask directly, because asking directly takes courage, and courage is something he lacks. So, he outsources. He hands over to your friends the role of improvised spies, but carefully selected. He knows who the most talkative ones are, who tends to be more distracted, and who is the most loyal. And he uses that. What's most troubling is that he's not just looking for facts. He's looking for signals, small hints, the tone of voice of the person responding, the pause before they speak, even the choice of words. He wants to detect if your name still carries weight when it's spoken, if there's hesitation, if the friend changes the subject too quickly or lingers for a moment longer, as if afraid a slipped detail might shift the course of the conversation. And every response, every gesture he files away mentally. He creates an invisible map of your emotional life. He tries to understand if you still feel, if you still think about him, if your absence is now permanent or just temporary. This behavior isn't new. Whenever insecurity took over, he sought indirect ways to reaffirm himself. But now there's one detail. He's no longer by your side, and that makes the game riskier and crueler, because deep down, what he fears isn't your forgetfulness. It's your freedom. It's realizing that you've built a space where he is no longer the measure of things, where your days don't revolve around what he does or doesn't do. Perhaps for him, knowing that you're doing well is unbearable, because it means that all the emotional weight he imagined carrying over you no longer exists, and that hurts, more than he admits to anyone, even to himself. That's why the questions are never neutral. They have direction, intent, and calculation. When a friend of yours says, "Oh, he asked if you still live in the same place," the phrase sounds simple, almost trivial, but behind it lies another. He wanted to know if you're still where he left you. And subtly, he compares the answers he gets today with what he knew about you before. He looks for stark changes, as if every alteration is proof that you're in motion, maybe fleeing, maybe rebuilding. He wants to know if you've changed your hairstyle, if you've started going out more, if you've made new friends. Even seemingly irrelevant details, like the times you tend to appear online, factor into this mental report. And the most ironic part? He might even tell those same friends that he doesn't feel anything anymore. But if that were true, there wouldn't be this almost meticulous effort to map your life. Do you see how revealing this is? Because in reality, each attempt he makes to discover something about you reveals much more about him than it does about you. And maybe, just maybe, a part of you has already sensed this movement. As if deep down you know that the questions don't come by chance. If this has happened to you, comment, "I needed to hear this." But here's a point that few understand. This kind of investigation doesn't just seek to satisfy curiosity. It's also a test. He wants to measure how willing you are to share information, even if indirectly. That's why sometimes the question is asked so casually that even your friend doesn't realize the weight it carries. And when you find out, it might be too late, because the game started long before you noticed you were in it. And there's something even more unsettling that you need to understand about this behavior. He doesn't just ask to know, he asks to measure your silence. Silence to him is a thermometer. If you don't say anything, he interprets it as coldness. If you say too much, he interprets it as longing. He never sees neutrality. Everything is a signal to him, and in a way, it is. Because you know you don't react the same way when something or someone no longer matters. The difference is that he isn't seeking peace in this realization. He's seeking control. You might wonder why someone who claims to have moved on still cares so much. The answer is simple. Moving on doesn't mean stopping the desire to win. And for him, victory is realizing that you still revolve around him, even if only in thoughts. So every time one of your friends brings him a stray comment, a vague reaction, or a detail about your life, he keeps it as evidence. For him, it's like confirming that there's still an invisible thread tying you together. But there's something he doesn't realize. When someone needs so many signals to feel secure, they've actually already lost their place. It's like he's trying to hold water in his hands. The harder he tries, the faster it slips away. And here comes the more strategic side. He doesn't always ask the same friends. He alternates. He keeps enough distance to avoid raising suspicion. He knows that if he repeats himself too much, someone might tip you off. So he spreads out the questions over weeks and months. This is the kind of movement that doesn't show up in a single day. It builds slowly like a whisper that starts to echo. And if you think about it, you might realize that even on social media, this game is happening. Selective likes, silent views on stories, comments on posts that on the surface have nothing to do with you, but carry coded messages. What he doesn't realize or doesn't accept is that all this activity reveals more than he would like, because to keep this network of observation active, he needs to expose himself. He needs to be present, even if disguised. Being present means that, no matter how much he says it's over, something inside him hasn't ended. Have you ever experienced that feeling? Knowing that someone is following your life from the sidelines without ever really getting close. This realization is uncomfortable because it blurs the lines between past and present in the same moment. It's as if he's always there, on the periphery of your field of vision. And this raises an important question. Why doesn't he talk directly to you? The answer is as human as it is strategic. Speaking directly risks hearing something he doesn't want to listen to. It risks confronting the truth that maybe you are, in fact, at peace. So, he prefers the shadows. He prefers to ask others. He prefers to feed on interpretations and half-truths, because that way he can keep alive the version of the story that suits him best. But here's a key point that changes everything. The more he tries to gauge you, the more he reveals himself. And sooner or later, someone will notice the pattern. The day you gain clarity on this, something shifts. Because from that moment on, each of his attempts to learn about you will no longer have the same effect. It won't be a silent invasion anymore, but a predictable act. And predictability is what destroys any psychological game. When you understand that he's trying to provoke a reaction, you gain choice. You can respond with silence, with calculated words, or even with a counter-movement that leaves him more confused than ever. And it's at this point that he starts to lose the control he so desperately seeks. But the story doesn't end here. Because deep down, this collection of information says less about you, and much more about his need to confirm something that may have never been true. And when you fully realize this, you'll see that the real question isn't whether you've moved on. It's whether he ever believed he could handle being surpassed. There comes a point when observation stops being mere curiosity and turns into obsession. At first, he might have thought that simply hearing from one or two friends that you were doing well would close the case. But something in him can't accept superficial answers. He needs details. He needs to know the how and the why. So, he starts pulling at finer threads. He asks about your job, but not because he cares about your career. Rather to find out if there's been a change indicating your life has taken a leap without him. He asks if you've been missing from parties, but not out of nostalgia for your presence. It's to gauge whether you've isolated yourself or if you're connecting with new people. The most ironic part is that, while he's trying to figure out if you're free from him, it's he who remains trapped. This creates a silent contradiction. He seeks evidence that you still think of him, all while needing to convince himself that he feels nothing anymore. This conflict is what keeps him moving, like someone unsure if they're investigating to heal or to reopen the wound. Have you noticed how some people fear becoming irrelevant in the lives of those they loved? That fear shapes every step he takes. He doesn't just want to know if you've moved on. He needs to be sure that if you have, it didn't happen too quickly. Because if it did happen quickly, it would mean he wasn't as essential as he believed, and that thought erodes any ego. So every bit of news he receives goes through a filter. If a friend says, "I think he's happy," he doesn't hear it as a compliment. He hears it as a threat. And so, with each new piece of information, he rewrites the mental map he's created of you. He adds question marks, draws imaginary connections, and interprets pauses as evidence. It's a nearly forensic endeavor, fueled by feelings he won't admit out loud. He might even feel that he's in control of this process. But in reality, each step he takes to understand your life only deepens his dependence on the answers. And there's something even deeper at play. This behavior creates a vicious cycle within him. Phase of restlessness. He feels the absence of knowing something about you. Phase of collection. He asks indirect questions to one of your friends. Phase of interpretation. He analyzes every detail of the response, no matter how small. Phase of reinforcement. He feels a temporary relief until the restlessness returns. This cycle repeats endlessly, and the more he goes through it, the harder it becomes to break free. If you really look closely, it's almost as if he's developed an inverted emotional dependency, not to receive direct affection from you anymore, but to gather fragments of your life through others. This keeps an illusion alive, that he still has some place in your world, even if it's as an invisible observer. And here's the most delicate part. If one day you decide to completely cut off the flow of that information, he will feel the impact like a real, almost physical absence. It's at this point that he may try to get closer directly, or potentially disappear altogether. But until then, he will keep using friends as antennas that pick up not just facts but feelings. He might ask something as simple as, "So, how's he doing?" But deep down, what he really wants to know is, does he still think about me when no one is watching? And that's a question that, try as he might to disguise it, reveals everything about what still lives inside him. If this has reminded you of someone, comment, "Yes." And it's at this point that the story begins to lean in a direction he never anticipated. The silent game he started to gauge you gradually begins to expose the very vulnerabilities he wanted to hide. At first, he believed that controlling the flow of questions and alternating friends as sources would ensure that no one would notice the pattern, but time always reveals. A mutual friend, who has been questioned more than once, starts to notice that conversations with him almost always revolve around the same subject, you, and not in an open way, but always with that careful, disguised construction, as if he's trying to talk about something else, and inevitably circles back to the same point. The repetition, no matter how much he tries to space it out, begins to sound like an echo, and echoes are noticeable. However, he does not realize how exposed he is becoming. To him, each interaction still seems strategic, but to those observing from the outside, the image forming is clear: a man who cannot let go. This is the moment when the investigation turns against the investigator, because when a friend perceives the veiled insistence, there's a risk that the information will end up exactly where he didn't want it, in your hands. And you know that perception changes everything. Once you see the pattern, his power over you diminishes drastically. Up until now, he had the advantage of moving in the shadows. Now the light begins to reach the places where he was hiding, and when the shadow breaks, there are two options left: retreat or confront. But to confront would mean exposing what he feels, and for someone who has built a persona of indifference, that's almost impossible. So, he tries to retreat, but retreating doesn't erase the history. The friends who are used as bridges still carry the memory of the questions, and every once in a while a comment slips out. Not out of malice, but because it's impossible to keep something that has already become evident for so long. This is the moment when you, even without looking for it, start to receive pieces of the puzzle, and when you fit them together, you realize that the story he publicly told, that he's fine, moving on, just doesn't match the silent reality that is revealed.